Good day, all you wonderful people. Welcome to Adventure Together. My name's Al, and today I'm going to tell you a little story about when a Widowmaker collided with my hammock when I was camping on the Appalachian Trail. Most of you are experienced hikers and know the term Widowmaker, but for those of you that don't, it's the term given for a tree branch that is suspended up in the tree branches, ready to fall. It's something that's dead, already hanging, and has broken off the tree, and is just waiting for a gust of wind to dislodge it and for it to fall down. They're called Widowmakers because when these things collide with people, they can often kill them or give them a very serious injury. So the fact that I had a Widowmaker fall on me and I was able to walk away from it is extremely lucky. Just going by the name, you can tell that this could have been extremely serious and I could have been killed if the Widowmaker had fallen on me in the wrong place. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, how did I end up sleeping underneath a Widowmaker and having it fall on me? Well, this all happened on day 62 of my thru hike. Myself and my tramley, which was made up of Red Panda and Holy Roller, were walking through southern Virginia on our way to Pearisburg, Virginia. We just left the Weary Feet hostel in Bland, where we had to stay for a couple of days because floodwaters had come up to the front doorstep and pretty much trapped us inside for a couple of days. When the floodwaters did eventually recede, we were able to walk out of the hostel, but that didn't mean the trail wasn't flooded. The trail had pretty much become a river, and we were walking through ankle-deep water most of the time, and sometimes knee-deep or hip-deep water. But that day, despite everything, we pushed on for 18 miles through the floodwaters to try and make it to a shelter called Dock Knob Shelter. We reached the shelter really late in the day and it was starting to get dark already. The storm clouds had been overhead and made it really dark all day, but this was starting to get really dark. And because of how dense the trees were all along the trail, there wasn't really a spot anywhere else where we could have set up. When we reached the shelter, Red Panda and Holy Roller went to fill their water bottles. I climbed the steps up to the front of the shelter to see if there was a place where we could camp for the night inside, out of the rain. We wanted to camp out of the rain because we were absolutely soaked from walking through all of that water all day, and all we wanted was somewhere dry and not to have to set up our tents. But when I got to the front of the shelter, I saw that every single bunk was full, and I got a very frosty reception from the people inside. The people that were there didn't look like hikers. They looked like they were there to have a party, and people there were passing around joints and bottles of whiskey. I tried to just say hello to a few people and then make my way out, and just at that point, Holy Roller climbed the steps and she looked into the shelter as well. And somebody had said to me, "There's no room here, you're just going to have to camp somewhere else." But as soon as he saw Holy Roller, a young female, he said, "Oh, there's plenty of room," and tapped the bed next to him. So Holy Roller and I just said, this isn't really somewhere we want to be. And we walked down the steps and we had a look around to see if there was somewhere they could pitch their tents or I could pitch a hammock. But because of how dense all the vegetation was, there was absolutely nowhere I could set up a hammock that hadn't already been taken by somebody else. For those of you who don't know the Dock Knob Shelter, it's completely surrounded by rocks and it's very hard to get a flat place to pitch a tent. So both Red Panda and Holy Roller said after we all filled our water bottles, we should just get out and have a look if there's somewhere else to camp. When we looked at the Guthooks app, there were a couple of dispersed camping spots that were located further up the trail. So we decided we would walk on and try our luck at one of those. The first one was located about half a mile up from the shelter, and it said on Guthooks it had room for about 3 tents. But when we got there, we saw that a group had already got there before us and had parked about 6 tents into this spot. So it was absolutely packed. So we carried on because we saw on Guthooks there was another dispersed camping spot about a mile on from that, and that had room for 2 tents. And I thought if there was room for Holy Roller's tent and Red Panda's tent, then I might be able to find a hammock spot. After walking a little while through that torrential rain and the cold and the wind, we eventually reached the next camping spot, which already had a group of 3 people that had parked their tents on there for the night. So at this point, with very little choice left, I said to Holy Roller and Red Panda, "You two go back to the shelter for the night. I'm going to carry on until I find somewhere I can put my hammock up, and then in the morning we'll meet. How about that?" But those two didn't want to split off, and so we remained a solid group and we carried on walking until a little further down the trail I saw there was a space in the foliage off the side of the trail that was flat enough to put a couple of tents. So we all waded into the vegetation and eventually found a spot. It was a little bit rocky, but they were able to make it work for their tents. And I found 2 trees that were the perfect distance apart that looked perfect for a hammock spot. By this time it had really gotten dark. The storm clouds had completely covered the sky. We were absolutely soaked and the rain was so heavy we just wanted to get into our shelters. So with the light quickly retreating and us needing headlamps to set up our tents and hammocks, I looked around above me and I couldn't see any widowmakers, and I thought this was a great spot. Once we had our shelters up for the night, we stayed inside our shelters and I cooked my dinner underneath my hammock tarp while the other two cooked their dinners inside the vestibule of their tents. We quickly ate and went straight to bed, and during the night the rain and wind only got stronger. It was absolutely hammering against us, and I've just spent most of the night awake with the torrential rain drumming off of my hammock tarp. The wind was whistling through the trees and I felt my hammock was swaying gently side to side because these big trees that I was up against were swaying in the breeze so much. It was really late, and the noise of the rain and the wind had just stopped me being able to get to sleep until I was completely exhausted. While I've been waiting to get to sleep, all around me I had just heard cracking as branches were falling from trees all around us. And then around 5 a.m. in the darkness as I slept, a massive crack had woken the three of us up and something had pinballed down through the trees, and then a massive force hit me across the chest, diagonally upwards to my shoulder here. I didn't know what it was. It was completely dark. I'd only been awake for about a split second, and suddenly this force had struck me across my chest. And my first thoughts were it was a bear, because I'd left my food bag underneath my hammock because it was so dark and so rainy I didn't want to hang it that night. So my hammock hit the floor. I didn't know what was going on. I was just in an immense amount of pain and I thought I was under attack. I was lying in a puddle of water and mud. I yelled out. Red Panda and Holy Roller came over quicker than I could have imagined. So we were standing around in the rain, and once we managed to get our headlamps on, we looked around and saw that there was a massive 6 foot to 7 foot long dead tree branch that had snapped in two when it had fallen out of the tree and hit me. It's about 5 a.m. and it's still dark and we're all absolutely soaked and it's still raining and we're completely covered in mud. And so we decided to try and get my shelter back up again so that I could sleep. And I saw, luckily, there was no damage to my hammock, and all it was a little bit wet and muddy from the fall. But once we managed to rehang the hammock, we saw that there was a massive rip in the tarp where the tree branch had come down and made a hole in it. So we got some Gorilla Tape and Dyneema patches from our repair kits, but we couldn't stick them on because the tarp was so wet and muddy that nothing would adhere to it. So we decided to pack up early and make our way into Petersburg earlier than we planned to, because I couldn't stay in my hammock because it was still torrential rain and there was a massive hole in the side and I would just get wet. As the sun came up around us, I looked up into the tree canopy and I saw where this tree branch had fallen from, and it hadn't actually been a widowmaker. It had been a branch that was still attached to the tree. It was only the rain and the wind that had managed to get that to break off in the night. Yes, looking at it, it was clearly a dead tree branch, but the tree itself was still alive. And because it had been so dark that night before when we were setting up our shelters, when I looked up to see if there were any widowmakers, I was only able to see the silhouette of tree branches and not the finer details. As I previously mentioned, the tree branch, when it had hit me on the ribs here and across my chest up to my collarbone on my right hand side. And as soon as it hit me, I felt an immense amount of pain that just continued on. But I've had fractured ribs before, and I thought that because the pain wasn't as intense as the fractured ribs I've suffered in the past, it wasn't serious enough to end my hike. Over the next few days, I kept poking my ribs to see if the pain was actually fractured ribs, and I decided that it definitely wasn't. But the pain continued on and still hasn't gone away to this day. And by wearing that backpack, I'd not been given my body the adequate rest to be able to heal properly. I didn't think the injury was anything more than a bone bruise at the time, because when I first had fractured ribs, I had difficulty breathing and I couldn't lie on that side at all. It was very uncomfortable for about 6 to 8 weeks. But when the tree branch hit me, I didn't have too much discomfort when I was sleeping, and I didn't have any pain when I was breathing. Despite this though, I did have quite bad bruising across my body where it struck me on the collarbone, and also the ribs had left a large bruise as well. I think that the fact that the Widowmaker hit me just 6 inches away from my chin shows how lucky I was not to take the full force of this tree branch hitting me completely to the face. If that had happened, I don't know if I would have survived. Also, I think having my hammock tarp and the fly net above me had taken a lot of the pressure out of that fall, and when it did hit me, it wasn't at full force. Every time I look back at the incident, I think how lucky I was not to get a serious injury There are a couple of lessons that could have been learned from this situation. Maybe it's that I shouldn't have been setting up in the dark. Maybe it's that I should have used my headlamp to look up into the branches above me and see if there was anything that was a potential danger. Honestly, with how dark it was and how wet and cold I was and how keen I was just to get into a shelter and get to sleep, I don't know if I would have continued on to another spot and set up somewhere else, seeing as that was the first hammock spot I'd seen in miles. Also, I think a factor of me wanting to take the first hammock spot that came along at that point was the fact that I just wanted Holy Roller and Red Panda to be able to finally get some rest. They seemed to be walking just because I was, and they could have set up back at the shelter if they wanted to. While we were breaking camp to get on our way to Perisburg, another couple of hikers stopped to talk to us, and they were talking about the state at Doc Snob shelter and also just how many fallen trees they'd seen on the path between the shelter and where we were. They said that overnight about a half a dozen trees had come down across the path. And while we were stood there talking to these two hikers, we heard a crack and another tree fell. Luckily, it didn't fall across the path because otherwise it would have wiped all 5 of us out. There really wasn't a place for us to run, and this tree was huge. So that goes to show the effect that the storm had had on these trees surrounding the path. So take what you want from this lesson. Maybe it is that we should be a bit more discerning when we're choosing our camp spots, even if it is dark and wet and cold. But honestly, I think the biggest takeaway from this is to be a lot more careful when looking up into the tree canopy to see if there's anything that is a potential danger to us. So that's it. That's my story of when a Widowmaker hit me while I was camping on the Appalachian Trail. Do you have any stories about Widowmakers? Please leave them in the comments down below. If you like this kind of video, then please leave a like. Please consider subscribing and share this video to anyone that you know that likes camping, hiking and adventure travel. And for now, that's it from me. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.